Okay. So yeah, the Paris Climate Agreement was adopted on the basis of the agreement of world governments that climate change requires urgent action. It contains long-term goals to be achieved to prevent the worst effects of climate change. It also introduces a new governance framework covering nationally defined contributions, 5-year audit cycles to increase future climate targets and long-term climate strategies. So many governments have already recognized the need to adopt the new long-term governance frameworks to effectively implement the Paris Agreement commitments in the national context. Adoption of climate laws has proven to be an effective measure in several countries already. So last year, also our Ministry of the Environment and Spatial Planning also started this process of adoption of the climate law. So kind of in order to establish a high quality discussion during this process, our guest, Lola Vallejo, from IDRI, Institute for Sustainable Development and International Relations, will present to us development and effective implementation of long-term climate governance that can be actually compatible with objectives of the Paris Agreement and with focus on concrete practices from French climate law. So thank you very much, and board is yours. If you want to use PowerPoint, you can click the share button. It's on the bottom. Yeah.
Perfect. So thank you very much. I'm really happy to present you some elements of the long-term climate governance in France and tell you a bit more about its genesis and hope that it will be useful to the Slovenian experience. So first, maybe why does it make sense to look at the... Can you hear me okay? Yes? Yes, I was just saying, why should we look at the French governance? First, because I think it's interesting in two regards. Although there is always debate as to what is a good or there's no system per se, the French system has been... Sorry, can you hear me okay?
Oh yeah, sorry, we have some technical issues, but I can hear.
Okay. Yes, so France's climate governance system is generally quite highly rated. I've put in my slide an assessment by the NGO World Wildlife Fund, WWF, of various long-term climate strategies in Europe. And France was actually rated quite high in terms of, you know, being clear as to who should do what, setting ambition, having an analytical basis. So, you know, there are some positive assessment, which means it's worth having a look at it. I think it's also interesting because in a relatively short period of time, so about 5 to 7 years, the governance system has evolved quite a lot and has been quite reactive to the ups and downs of, you know, political processes and has kind of shown some capacity to learn and refine itself, not just in the content of the governance system, but also in terms of what is the overall ambition. And it shows that you can increase ambition over time as long as you have a good governance system. So what are the key ingredients of the climate governance system in France? First, I would say it has some of the key ingredients of an effective climate governance system, which starts with legally binding targets, an economy-wide carbon price signal, but also, probably most importantly, strong governance mechanisms to ensure there is effective planning in line with the long-term ambition. So the governance mechanisms are there. And even though, you know, we'll see in a few minutes that we need to improve the policy making itself, I would say that France has some interesting governance features that makes it worth looking at. Some implications of these ingredients. For me, the French case also highlights the importance of going beyond energy-only policy. So when you think about decarbonizing your economy, you can't just look at decarbonizing electricity production or even, power as a whole, but you have to look at various sectors such as transport, buildings, agriculture, waste, forestry. What's interesting is our national conversation on climate governance was still kickstarted by a national energy debate. Maybe a word of context. Our presidential elections in 2012 saw the election of a socialist candidate, which had in his campaign tried to strike a compromise with its Green Party allies regarding what would be the space of nuclear energy in the electricity mix in France. One thing that you may know about the French energy system is that our electricity production relies very heavily on nuclear power. So, over 70% of our electricity is produced from nuclear power plants. And there was an ambition to discuss whether this was too high and whether we should aim to reduce our reliance on nuclear power. So following the election, there was an 8-month-long debate that was organized with various experts involving citizen consultations, thematic groups, so very large debating exercise that ultimately landed us with our first massive, interesting piece of legislation, the 2015 Energy Transition Law. So we have given a specific study, which you can look into for more information. But basically, let me tell you about the key strategic objectives. So a bit like the European climate governance, the French climate law was organized around different strategic objectives regarding climate, so greenhouse gas emissions, energy efficiency, and also renewable energy sources deployment. The law was creating, very interestingly, 2 types of strategic plans. One was the National Low Carbon Strategy, the acronym in French is SNBC, which aims to give strategic orientations for all sectors, so not just energy, and defines carbon budgets for 3 or 5-year periods. This is very much inspired by the UK Climate Change Act from 2008, which also sets a long-term target and then kind of divides up the period from now to then in 5-year budgets, and which allows the government to plan how it's going to achieve its next target. The government also created a multi-annual energy plan, or PPE in French, which gives specific quantified targets for the energy sector. And this time, this plan was planned ahead in 10 years periods, so in 2 5-year periods. So the next 5-year period is the one that's really binding, and the one after that is illustrative, or giving a signal to the sector. And both of these plans are revised every 5 years. Now, they're not equal, and in practice, the multi-annual energy plan has been taken a lot more seriously by actors from the energy sector, as opposed to the National Low Carbon Strategy, which has had ownership issues, but we'll come back to that. The law also was setting an institutional framework. One, giving a permanent home for stakeholder consultation on ecological transition, which is called National Council for the Ecological Transition. And this body was a direct emanation of the national energy debate that I was talking to earlier, if you remember. It was a way to make sure that when the debate was ending, there would still be a place for various stakeholders, including local authorities, MPs, NGOs, industry representatives, to kind of confront their views about the best way to achieve the national objectives. There was also an expert committee, an independent expert committee, set up to kind of advise and give, well, advice to the government on how it was faring in terms of its long-term objective. This institution, however, had very little resources, and as we will see later, was kind of revised and overhauled quite significantly to make sure it was more effective, but we'll come back to that. Finally, interestingly, France had also an article of this law that was to do with finance and asking institutional investors to consider environmental, social, and governance criteria while doing their investments, but also to report on how they were integrating climate risk in the management of their portfolio. And this was quite innovative at the time. It's the first country where this is mandatory for all the large institutional investors managed by the Banque de France. So in short, the energy transition law had several headline targets for different time periods. As I said, the key one was the kickstart of this whole energy debate was reducing the share of nuclear in electricity production to 50%, which was done both to kind of increase our energy security. So if you have a more varied source of energy sources, you are less dependent. If there is one failure, it makes your whole system more resilient. And it was also a way to create more space for the deployment of renewables, because France is still lagging behind its European objectives for renewables deployment. Maybe without entering in the detail, the two that I found really interesting in structuring are the ones that are long-term to 2050. So France was committing to dividing by 4. So we had this kind of factor 4 reference for a while. So, reducing by 75% the greenhouse gas emissions compared to 1990. And also to divide by 2 its final energy consumption compared to 2012, which is huge. And, basically you imagine that there's going to be some electrification of your end use sectors. But because this mandates France to be incredibly ambitious in terms of energy efficiency and also to completely reduce its dependence on other fossil fuels. So for instance, oil in the transport sector. So very ambitious objectives, but interestingly, long-term objectives that give a sense of where the country is heading long-term. Now, after this mandate of this first president, so in 2012, the next president elected in 2017, Emmanuel Macron, set a new higher bar for France's climate action. So he was running on a platform, and then as soon as he was elected, produced a climate plan, which was essentially his manifesto, which he enacted shortly after coming into office, setting the country to 2 things. First, to reaching carbon neutrality, which means achieving a balance between emissions and sinks, according to what the IPCC said was necessary globally if we want to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. And also to prohibit any fossil fuel extraction from 2040. So what did this mean in practice? The first long-term strategy that, if you remember, was devised in 2015, had to be revised shortly after the climate plan was published to reflect 2 things. First, that we had a higher 2050 objectives, going from minus 75% in emissions to carbon neutrality, but also to reflect that France had missed its first carbon budget. The first budget was running from 2015 to 2018. So as a result, you can see the overshoot on the graph that is on the slide in front of you. As a result, the second budget, which started in 2019 and will end in 2023, has been artificially increased by 6%, which means that the curve will get steeper and that we will need to do steeper efforts to still meet our 2050 targets. So it might sound paradoxical or not realistic to, at the same time, increase the ambition while you're missing your short-term targets. But this is very much at the core of the long-term planning of climate governance. Unless you know how drastic your efforts need to be, it's really difficult to impulse the large-scale changes that need to happen across all sectors. So this was translated in a new energy bill, energy and climate bill, I should have said, which basically revised the objectives that were previously embedded. I've said more ambitious because, in 2050, we're going, as I said, from -75 to carbon neutrality. We're also increasing our interim target of reducing primary energy consumption. But as a result, the compromise that France made was pushing back its deadline for meeting the reduction in nuclear share of electricity production. This used to be 2025, and it has now been pushed to 2035. So these were, again, very big changes, and that's kickstarted a lot of debate in French circles, where nuclear energy is a very sensitive topic, and where environmentalists do not always agree. What was sure is, no matter how you took these different changes in targets, that meant that the deployment of renewable electricity needed to increase quite substantially. So a tripling of onshore wind capacity and a multiplication by a factor of 5 of the solar PV. As I said, the first carbon budget had been missed. In 2017, France was almost 7% off track compared to the pathway it had set itself to carbon neutrality. And the strategy for national low carbon had kind of allocated this budget for different sectors. And the sectors that were most off track were buildings, which means that there were very little energy efficiency gains made, and transports. Also in 2018 was a moment of great social unrest in France, which I'm sure you've all heard about, called the Yellow Jackets. So the Gilets jaunes movement was started in part because the government was planning to increase the contribution climat-énergie, which is effectively the carbon tax that applies in particular to fuel that citizens pay to, power their cars. And this has sparked a lot of debate and a lot of protests, a lot of strikes, and even quite a bit of violence in the streets. But if you take a closer look at what the content of the debate was about, it was much more about the unfairness of the measure rather than a criticism of we don't want any climate action or we don't recognize the need for climate action. So it was really a call for soul searching as to how could policymakers reflect the need of French society to address climate change while mitigating the social impacts and being mindful of social justice. So as a response measure, the government froze the carbon tax, decided not to increase it that year, and launched a decentralized debate that was about reconciling social and environmental transition for 3 months. And this was focusing on the accessibility of concrete solutions to ordinary citizens. We have made some recommendations as to how the the carbon tax should be amended, which have also been made by several other think tanks in France, including adapting its level to the variations of oil prices, work with banks to lower the cost of loans for building thermal renovation, and increasing transition contracts with territories affected by the transition. These recommendations were made to the government, and some of them have been taken up, but I'll get back on this. Some final word of context on this is basically the French carbon tax is actually, by itself not that high compared to other countries, but if you take the global price of gas itself is quite expensive, or at the similar level of countries which have a much higher carbon tax than France. So, there needs to be a bigger reflection on what do you do with the revenues of this tax to make sure that the tax is more acceptable to people. I'd like to present now 3 innovations that took place very recently in the French problem, in the French context, to address specific problems. The first one I would call the ecological cabinet. The starting point for this proposal was the president felt like there was a lack of cross-cutting ownership within government on climate and biodiversity issues. So the presidential institution created this Ecological Defense Council in 2019, which stems directly from this national debate. And that is about having the president holding his cabinet meeting, but effectively these are happening every 2 months and sort of branded as ecological defense, which is a way to show that under certain circumstances or on certain topics, at least regularly, when there will be arbitrage between the different ministries, the Ministry of Environment can come on top. And it is a way also to kind of publicize or give more impact to some decisions that the government makes, which are supportive of climate and biodiversity. Some of the latest decisions that have been taken in those Ecological Defense Council include, for instance, abandoning a very controversial urban development project in the outskirts of Paris called Europa City, abandoning as well a gold mining project in Guyana, and, for instance, deciding that all the government services and all the public ministries and institutions would all be exemplary in terms of procurement, energy use, and consumption practices. So it's a start. I think there's only been 2 or 3 of those. I would say they have the potential to be quite transformative, as long as a broader community of stakeholders also precise how they could be used and which topics would make a real difference. A second interesting governance development is following the Gilets jaunes. The general impression was that there was a lack of acceptability of climate measures. So if you asked in polls, most French people would say that they supported climate action, but in practice, try and raise the carbon tax and everyone is in the streets. So as a response to that, the government created the Citizen Assembly on Climate. What's interesting is it is a direct demand from the Yellow Jackets movement, because an emanation of these movements was called the Citizen Jackets, and they were asking for such an assembly. to increase direct participation in democracy and enhance the ownership of citizens of climate solutions. So a few key facts about this assembly. It's composed of 150 citizens, which are selected randomly. They also have to be representative of France's population, so representative especially in terms of gender, age, and in terms of education background, which is taken as one of the most accurate marker for social background as well. The assembly is actually organized around 7 weekends, 7 intense working weekends, from 19th of October until the 20th of April. And its reflections are structured around 5 themes: inhabiting, or it's living, but I wasn't sure if it would read strangely on my slide. So which buildings do you live in, and what conditions do you live? Eating, moving around, so mobility, consuming, and also working or producing. And the mission that was given to this assembly was very specific. It was to suggest measures on how to reduce emissions by 2030, and reducing emissions by 40% by 2030, which is aligned with the current European commitment, in a spirit of social justice. So one little note on this, I think it would have been interesting to task the citizens with thinking even more to the long term, because I'm sure they'll think about that anyway, because they have been briefed a lot about the longer term picture, but also trying to give a specific numbered objective might be a bit tricky, because how can you be sure that the measures they propose actually add up to 40%? What's interesting is from the start, and maybe at the difference of other participatory processes in France before, there's been a lot of emphasis on what would be done with these recommendations. And from the start, the president has engaged his responsibility to say that the recommendations will be submitted to Parliament or submitted to a referendum if the citizens deem this necessary, or it could be turned into binding regulations. And to make sure that this citizen assembly was not used or directed by the government's wishes, a very important government that was independent was set up. I'm sure you've heard of these citizen assembly. There are similar-ish experiences, first in Ireland. So one such assembly was devised a few years ago in Ireland and had really incredible results. The UK has started its own assembly under the authority of the Parliament that's looking more at the long-term target, but there have also been experiences at the local level. One last innovation in terms of governance that I wanted to mention was the increasing role of experts in the monitoring and evaluation. In our analysis, we had identified that monitoring and evaluation was definitely an area of improvement in the climate governance system in France, because we're very good at setting ambitious targets, but not very good at looking back at the policies we've implemented, saying what has worked and what hasn't, and how can we make it better, and kind of monitor year on year, how are we doing compared to these ambitious targets? I had mentioned before this expert committee set up in 2015, but it had very little resources and was only giving a few pages of advice, which, although good, just did not have the same kind of aura and echo that other similar independent institutions, such as the Committee on Climate Change in the United Kingdom, can have. So as a response to this perceived gap, the government set up the High Council for Climate in 2018, about at the same time that the national debate following the Gilets jaunes movement was announced. This High Council has a mandate of assessing every year the government's action on climate and making recommendations on how to improve it. So it's an independent watchdog that brings together expertise from various fields and is going to be an independent and legitimate voice in the public debate that hopefully should have much more of a weight in influencing the government's action. The Council for the Climate is directly attached to the Prime Minister office. And it should be viewed very differently from analysis that could be done from think tanks like us or NGOs, because it's effectively a publicly set institution. So I encourage you to have a look at the 2019 assessment report, which broad message was actually about France needing to act in line with its own ambition. So the key word was coherence throughout, because even though we have these ambitious targets, as is the case in many places, we don't have short-term policies that are aligned with the ambition of those targets. So they made some concrete suggestions, which I've copied here. First, to give a much more space to public policy evaluation for climate issues. As I said, looking backward and seeing what has worked and what hasn't to allow us to improve our policies. It's okay not to get it right from the first time, but you need to make sure you have some mechanism that allows you to revisit and learn over time. Also to, select laws which will need to be assessed because their climate impact could be substantial, and there should not be any legislative proposal that goes against the climate objectives. The national low carbon strategy should also be strengthened, for instance, through a detailed impact assessment, but also strengthening its implementation by giving much more precise mission orders to every ministry. Transport, agriculture is going to be key for this vision to become reality. And also to make sure that policy implementation, policy evaluation should be trusted. And to be trusted, it should be transparent, independent, and also a consultative process. So one that involves stakeholders that are directly concerned by it. I'm very happy to take questions. This was my overview. And thank you very much for your attention. I hope I haven't been too long.
Okay, thank you very much. Are there any questions? As I said, you can either write them in the chat or just unmute your microphone. And so maybe to break the ice, let's say, as I said before, the Slovenian law is currently under preparation, and it includes basically only a long-term goal and a very vague definition of climate council. So in your opinion, what can such law even bring to us in connection with implementing the goals of Paris Agreement?
Thank you. I think I've tried to give some pointers to that at the beginning of my presentation. I think the best thing these laws can do is give a very clear direction of travel and essentially give a sense of inevitability. So at least it needs to show that the government is serious about a target and is going to deploy every public policy instrument at its disposal to move the country towards this goal. So the climate law should have a clear target. It also needs, if you remember the various targets we have, either having interim targets or budgets to get there is also a way to kind of keep track. Because if you only start from today and look ahead 30 years without having some goalposts along the way, it's quite easy to get lost and to not know how am I doing towards this long-term goal. So having, interim targets is also helpful, in addition to the long-term one. And to make sure that you have the right system to kind of, pull your sleeve and tell you how you're doing. The governance mechanism is also a key part, or, almost imagine a wheel, a relay of transmission. Many countries in the world, but especially in Europe, have started to invest in independent authorities. At every level, you can find this an effective system, because even as a citizen or as a stakeholder, it's more legitimate and better seen if it's coming from a public authority that is still independent from government. Once you're in government, officials, may not have completely the liberty to assess and really transparently the policies. So a public institution that can have access to the data due to its public nature, while being independent from the ministry in charge of implementation, it means that you're not judge and party. And I would say that these are probably the three key components of a climate law, in my opinion.
Okay, thank you. We have some more questions in the chat, so if you'd like, you can read them out yourselves.
That's okay.
But
so Maya, I think, says how to activate citizens to participate in the Convention citoyenne. So the citizen assembly, the citizens taking part in the assembly themselves were handpicked, are kind of compensated for their time, and the travel and lodging expenses are paid. It's very budget, but it's working. Many of them have actually taken to it quite a lot. And you're right, one interesting way this could be have a broader echo is maybe several things. First, it's been quite an open process, and also to researchers. So there's been a community of social scientists and participation specialists and climate experts that have attended the debates, sometimes to kind of support the facilitation of the work of the citizens, but also to kind of report back. And so that means that there's been a bigger presence in the media that contributed to raising the profile of the assembly, because they would then write op-eds or articles. All the debates and all the sessions are televised, so not necessarily the citizens' debates among themselves, but any intervention from experts, of which there have been quite a lot, because these people were not climate experts at all, and they needed to have some tools to make their decisions. Everything is available on YouTube, and that's a very powerful tool to make sure that we raise awareness and increase the knowledge base of any interested citizen. There's quite a few more. How is the independence of the citizen assembly assured in practice? So the citizen were independently chosen. First, it was a random selection process where there was a robocall that was just, making up phone numbers out of the blue, calling people up. And the questions was, would you be interested in principle? Yes or no? Taking some information about the person if they said yes. And then confirming later on who would be selected, because it wasn't based on who was voluntary. It was based on having a representative sample of the French population. On the outset, 2/3 of people said that in principle they would be open to attending. The vast majority of them had never taken part in a participatory process before. So these were not activists by any means. A few were, did not believe in climate change, just as in the French population, but not that many. And they have very different profiles. Some are more, high profile and starting to become, having a little media presence. But most are just everyday people. You have students, you have homeless people, you have retired people, and they don't all agree. But I think over time they've really bonded as a community. And the independence is kind of assured by this yellow jacket emanation I was talking about, the citizen jackets. They're part of the governance committee. They're among the governance system that makes sure that there is going to be accountability and government is going to pay attention to what comes out. But it also means that all the deliberation is really open. It's building on an existing body called the Economic and Social Council, which is a very old institution created after World War II, which has, again, representative from trade unions, companies, and local authorities. And so half of the governance committee of the Citizen Assembly come from this body, and the other half is selected specialists of climate policy, participatory democracy, etc. The next question is, how does the Conseil de défense écologique work? Namely, what mechanism does it have to make the government departments to implement the recommendation? So in practice, this is headed by the president himself, Emmanuel Macron, and France is a very presidential system. So if the president says that you have to do something, you will do it. To be honest, the Conseil de défense écologique is partly just a 2 hours meeting where decisions that have been already made are kind of validated and given, more media amplification. But it is nevertheless, I think, an interesting conduit because in terms of political representation, it shows that first it acknowledges that there is this kind of trade-off of conflict between environmental concerns and others, and it also sets the scene for, in certain instances, there will be arbitrage more favorable to the environment. Now, of course, there are some really hard questions where the Environment Ministry always comes below. In France, for instance, we would need to really renovate our agricultural system to make it more ecologically friendly. And this is one very hard topic that I personally would love to see on the agenda, but hasn't come up yet. So for me, the capacity of this ecological cabinet to really tackle the hard topic is something that will make or break its legitimacy going forward. Is there a quantified carbon budget set for the French 2050 net zero climate target? So, very good question, because carbon neutrality, climate neutrality can be taken to mean many different things. And that was one of the loopholes that environmentalists were quite worried about when the law was passed. So, to be clear, there is no budget per se. The compromise that was found was saying that, so previously we needed to reduce our emissions by 75%, which meant dividing them by 4. And the neutrality objective was defined as dividing emissions by at least 6. And I'm sorry I haven't shown that. I'm sure I have a picture of that somewhere, but effectively in the French national low carbon strategy, you do have this breakdown between residual emissions and sinks by 2050. So there have been already some assumptions. As I said, the problem is, what is the status of this national strategy? Because it hasn't, the kind of sectoral breakdown or the the residual emissions level has not been endorsed either by law or by specific ministry. So the devil will really lie in the detail of the implementation. Let me see if I can find. I'll have a look to. I'm sure I can share my screen to show you what the split of emissions is supposed to be. If yes, what is the amount in megaton of CO2 equivalent of the French fair share carbon budget, and for which Paris Agreement targets either 1.5 or 2 or higher, and for which probability in the frame of IPCC 66%, 50%, or something else? Now, these are all very good questions. I'm afraid I don't have that level of detail, because I think we have not been as specific. The French legislation doesn't really refer to that level of detail. It does. France very much sees itself as a guardian of the Paris Agreement. So it kind of states that this commitment is Paris compatible, but you're right that it doesn't go into too much justification as to why this is the fair share. Effectively, it goes even beyond the IPCC 1.5 report, which states that globally the world needs to be at carbon neutrality, so CO2 only neutrality by 2050, and strongly reducing other greenhouse gases. Whereas the neutrality objective for France in 2050, like the European one, is all greenhouse gas neutral by 2050. I find it interesting that the two largest countries that came out for neutrality in the EU, France and the UK, now that the UK is not in the EU anymore, but they've both chosen the same objective as the EU, which, you're right, is, you instantly think, if the EU as a whole needs to get to that level, surely France needs to go beyond that. But it's also one of the political advantage of shooting first, is you can come across as very ambitious. Although, if you take a step back in the European lens, it is going to be hard for you to meet that objective if France doesn't do more, especially now that the UK is leaving, and the UK was a rather progressive state on climate policy. Very good question from George. How is the 50% reduction of nuclear received? It's very ambitious for a country with so many reactors. That's absolutely true. It has been controversial, even to this day. I've only started working in France for a few years at the national level, and I find the topic so sensitive because historically, a large part of the state administration and the elite education is very hell-bent on the merits of nuclear. So even though there's a counter movement stating the risks of nuclear or the dangerousness of relying too much on one source of energy, and I think there have been some good economic cases for why relying that much on one single source would be potentially dangerous. It's still a very hotly contested topic. So, and the fact that we've kind of pushed back this objective by 10 years, it shows in itself that it's still a very contested topic. I think it's changing slightly. Some kind of taboo has been broken because our current environment minister has recently asked the French company EDF to look at 100% renewables scenario for the electricity system. And actually the grid operator, RTE, has actually been also more open to discussing what would be the implications of having more renewables in the grid, showing that it would not be insurmountable. So it's I would say there's a large share of ideological position in the debates, but it seems to be moving. When the whole energy debate was kickstarted in 2013, it was also on the back of the Fukushima disaster and a kind of a growing defiance against nuclear energy. And now in some ways the tide has receded also because climate concerns have risen, and many voices are now using this growing concern to say we can't afford to reduce our share of nuclear because we're not going to have enough renewables quickly enough. And look at what Germany does. France loves to compare with its German neighbor, whose emissions have increased following the closure of its nuclear reactors. So the debate is still very much alive, but we have done some analysis as well showing that for midterm objective, it would be good to have certainty and to prepare for a deployment of large-scale renewables.
Oh.
There's one last question. Thank you so much. These questions are amazing, by the way. Any recommendations for improving public awareness on these issues? In Slovenia, we have a big issue with misinformation regarding renewables, the need for big power plant investments, and so on. I've worked in the UK for a bit and now in France. And what I was saying earlier regarding the climate law and the importance of having an independent public institution talking about climate issues is very important. I feel like in the UK, the debate was a lot more, of course you still had, environmentalists and industry and blah, 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 but you could still have a more, a quieter debate, I think, in many ways, that in France, where the gap in discourse and solutions is very wide between nuclear and no nuclear, or the problem is nuclear tends to focus so much of the brain power and energy that we completely forget some really hard questions about getting rid of oil in transport, how to increase the buildings renovation, how to tackle agriculture, which is an incredibly difficult topic and has so many ramifications for biodiversity and other topics. But I think the High Council for Climate, so this independent institution, is, I hope, at least we put some faith in it, is a step in the right direction, because it's going to add legitimacy, because it's an institution that was decided by the Emmanuel Macron himself. It's attached to the Prime Minister. And they're also, giving their reports to Parliament, and government has to respond to their reports every 6 months after publication. So, it's not exactly how to fight against fake news on renewables, and we still have some really misleading articles. But by and large, the press has also incredibly improved its coverage. And again, I think having some high-level public figures which are seen as scientists and not, proponents of one solution or another, or activists, even though I don't think there's anything wrong with being an activist, but, you do hold a side in the argument. I think it really helps to bring clarity to the debate.
Thank you very much again. One last call for questions. And one more time, you really can also unmute yourself and pose the questions yourself. You don't have to just write it down to be clear. But if there are no questions, then thank you very much again for this insightful presentation and all the answers to the questions. So yeah, let's end it here, I guess.
No, thank you very much. It was really interesting for me to hear all your questions and happy to help in any way I can. Good luck to Slovenia on its climate transition.
Yeah, we'll need some luck, but also other things.
Right.
Okay, thank you and goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.